Now welcome here. This is something that I'm gonna be doing every month or so, depending on, of course, how many movies I need to watch, where I take a filmmaker and I view their entire filmography and then make a tier list of them. If you like this, then make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to suggest another filmmaker for me to cover here, then write their name in the comments below. And without further ado, here is the David Fincher tier list, Forgotten Reel edition. And to begin with, we have not so great a start with Alien 3, which according to the poster promises 3 times the suspense, 3 times the danger, 3 times the terror. And it is none of these things, which based on what few things I learned about the behind-the-scenes drama on this movie, it's not really Fincher's fault. He was kind of brought in late on and wasn't really allowed to do much with this project and seemed to be mostly kind of a director for hire. But there are some bright spots. So let's begin with the core premise of this movie. After Aliens, the ship that Ripley escaped from crash lands on this prison colony thing, where we find out that Newt and Hicks, and later on Bishop as well, have died off screen, no less. Which if you like those characters, I guess fuck you then, because I guess the writers or whoever was in charge of this project just did not know what to do with them, so they went to the trash bin. And in the case of Bishop, quite literally. So not really coming in at a great start and not really endearing yourself to the fans of the previous movies. But this setting is though kind of interesting, and there are some really great potential. There's some really great potential with it. Namely that Ripley here is not just does not just have to deal with the xenomorph, but she also has to deal with the very aggressive and sexually aggressive prisoners who are an added danger to the whole scenario. And even though, it does not follow up with some of the other characters from the previous movies that survived, it does have some good characters. Sigourney Weaver is great as always. And then there's Charles Dance, who is also just fantastic in this movie. And then there's also the breakout character for this movie, Dylan, played by Charles S. Dutton, who is probably the most fascinating character, the one who goes through the sort of only arc in the entire movie, starting off as this sort of repentant religious sinner who is trying to make up for his really horrible and dark past, who ends up finding some kind of redemption by helping Ripley. And another positive is also, I really like the set design and the whole aesthetic of the movie. They really did a great job of creating this sort of really grimy outback prison colony deep in space that is just completely abandoned by the rest of society, besides these few men and the few handlers they have to sort of oversee them. But that's where the positives end, because this movie has some issues. Namely, that it is way too long and really boring. Coming in at around the hour and a half mark, I checked the time, feeling like about 2 hours or more had come, and I found out that there was even more of this movie left. And at which point, a deep feeling of terror sat in my heart, because I realized that I had to watch even more of this movie, which moves at a snail's pace, and is not helped by the fact that it's a major downgrade from the previous movie. Like, Aliens made the brilliant choice of not just making the same movie again, but instead sort of expanding upon it, expanding the danger by having multiple aliens, and then expanding the action by having actually trained soldiers fighting them. And some fans of the original movie kind of have gripes with that, because they feel like, oh, now it's just a dumb action film, and the previously terrifying and nigh on invincible xenomorph is now just sort of a bullet sponge. But it was a logical progression from the previous movie. This is not so. Here we again have just gone to one alien, and this time it's because it impregnated like a dead cow or something. It moves differently or something, but we barely get a sense of that. And it's mostly just the same creature again, only this time there are more people, less weapons, and I guess that's supposed to sort of create more danger and more suspense, but it really does not. It also doesn't help that the alien is really lame in this. They try to build it up as this sort of terrifying, almost invincible killing machine, but that's kind of ruined by the fact that it really feels slow. Like the whole climax, we see the alien and we see from its perspective chasing after the prisoners, trying to kill them. But somehow this sort of apex predator is way slower than a bunch of normal humans who manage to outrun it constantly. And then there are some shots where just out of nowhere it's able to sprint and catch up to them. And so not only is the alien very inconsistent, it just feels very nerfed. And the whole movie just feels kind of tedious because you're just seeing Ripley do the same goddamn thing you've seen her do for the past 2 movies. And I kind of can't blame the writers or whoever was in charge of this project, because I have doubts about whether or not you can do much more with the Alien franchise, because the core concept is very simplistic. Like, the core concept is just a mysterious alien is found, it starts infecting the humans and starts killing the humans. And there's really not much more you can do with it. Maybe I'll get into more detail if I ever cover Prometheus and Alien Covenant. But any sort of attempt at expanding the lore of the Alien universe and sort of explaining what these creatures are and where they came from has kind of just diminished the terror and diminished the mystery, which was a major part of this franchise. And also just expanding more from aliens is also not that good of an idea. Like, what are we going to do? Like, have an entire planet of xenomorphs and have like an army of humans fight an army of xenomorphs? Like, that feels kind of lame. And at that point, the people who have gripes with aliens would really have a point, because now the xenomorphs don't feel like a threat anymore because they're just being mowed down left and right. So overall, this movie just feels like a more boring, slower version of the first movie, and not really a great start for Fincher. But, you know, it's not a bad movie. Like, as a sort of space thriller monster movie, it's pretty good. But its main problem is it's following up from 2 of the best sci-fi horror movies ever made. So not only does it have really big shoes to fill, but it also has to deal with the fact that not much more can be done with this franchise. So I'm going to give it a E tier. But Fincher, possibly because he really wanted to prove himself, really did so with his next movie, Seven. And you can really see that this is the kind of movie that Fincher really wanted to make. And this is really much his sort of comfort zone and where he really thrives, which is a grimy, dirty, up crime thriller. So the story of this movie is that in a unnamed city that is sort of kept aloof and kept vague to create this sort of idea of a corrupt, crime-ridden city where there's really no justice, there is a rash of religiously themed murders where each victim represents one of the 7 sins. So detectives Somerset, played by Morgan Freeman, and Mills, played by Brad Pitt, go chase after this serial killer, try to stop him before he claims all 7 victims. And this movie starts with a bang, with a just fantastic intro, which is something that I really miss from movies. It's not something that you see much, but I really love the sort of editing. I love the remix of Nine Inch Nails' Heresy that really fits in with the movie's themes and the whole tone of the thing. And I love how it sort of sets the tone for the entire movie, so you know what you're getting into. And the writers did a good job of creating a nice contrast between the two and both of their ideals. Somerset being this very jaded, close to retirement old detective who has sort of lost faith in his job, lost faith in humanity, and really does not see much hope for the city he lives in. And then there is Mills, who we learn chose to go to this city because he felt he could do more good there. And this is kind of an insane idea because it is constantly talked about how grimy and impossible and disgusting this city is, how there's really nothing you can do as a detective there. And a lot of the movie is sort of their ideas clashing against one another as they chase after this serial killer. And speaking of which, one major star of this movie is the just brutal, creativity of the murders in this movie. We start off with the gluttony victim, who was an obese man who was forced to eat until he just burst, which is just a gruesome, disgusting idea which I always like in murder mysteries, where they don't just start off with someone getting killed in like a banal way. Like if you start off with a murder that is extra fucked up, extra creative, it sort of evokes a question of like, okay, who could have done this? What kind of person is so twisted that they would want to actually do this? And it makes the case all the more interesting, while also giving the serial killer a lot of character. Like, as the movie goes along and we see more kills, like even without meeting him, we get a lot of idea of what kind of guy John Doe is. That he's this religious loon who really likes to toy with people. And I would say one of my favorite kills in this movie is probably the sloth one. Even though it does not really fit in with the rest of the kills, because like each victim beforehand kind of, committed the 7 sins. Like you have greed, who was this sleazy lawyer. We have gluttony, who was an obese man. We have pride, who was a model. And lust, who was like a sex worker. And so on and so on. But sloth doesn't really fit that, unless there's something I'm missing. But the way he was not killed, but just brutally tortured is just like bone chilling. Like when you see his like zombified body and you see him wake up and you realize, oh god, he's alive. He's in just deep agony, and then you hear that his mind is just mush. Then you really get an idea of just how, not just fucked up John Doe is, but just how persistent and obsessed he is, which makes him all the more dangerous. And one part of this scene as well is just the set design. Like we see like one of those scent things that people put in their cars, which of course is a very clever idea of showing like, okay, here's how he hit this act, by just masking the smell through a mountain of scented things. And the whole movie has just a fantastic aesthetic and a fantastic interior design, like perfectly capturing this like grimy, disgusting, dilapidated city that seems on the verge of falling apart without going like too over the top. It looks just realistic enough to be believable, while also creating this atmosphere of like just complete evil and corruption. And one other aspect of this movie that I really liked is the sort of clever way the writers kept the case going, by not just having John Doe be one step ahead all the time, but having the detectives find like clever and creative solutions to chase after him. One really notable example is how Somerset uses a contact of his to get into the FBI sort of watch list for libraries to see, okay, who has been renting the kinds of books that a guy who is murdering people based on like the 7 sins, what kind of books would he be renting out, and who has been renting them out, and using that to narrow it down to one person. And overall, the whole story just never ceases to surprise and keep things interesting. You're always expecting, okay, what kind of fucked up next kill is this guy gonna perpetrate? How are they gonna chase after them, and who is this guy? Who could have done this? And then we find out in a really clever twist where the killer just goes to the police precinct and just apprehends himself. And he is, of course, played by Kevin Spacey, who, may or may not have done some pretty bad things, which makes his already just downright disturbing portrayal even more creepy. And then there's, of course, the final twist where there are only 2 more sins left, envy and wrath. You keep thinking like, okay, they haven't actually caught him before he perpetrated those crimes. He has some like other victims out there. And then we find out in one of the most iconic twists of all time, and one of the most iconic endings of all time, and one of the most iconic uses of boxes of all time, that John Doe has not only killed Mills's wife, but that he is envy, and that he planned all this knowing that Mills would shoot him, and that Mills would be wrath, which kind of gets into one minor gripe I have with this movie, which is the sort of genius serial killer trope, which this movie kind of, there was Silence of the Lambs before, but this also kind of helped popularize the idea of the genius serial killer, who is just this genius planner who is one step ahead of everyone, who is able to concoct these insane schemes and predict how everyone is going to act, which is not that accurate to how serial killers usually are, based on what I've read about some of them. Most of them just kind of seem like compulsive lunatics who kill because they get off on it, not because they have this sort of moral crusade or something like that. And there's one sort of moment that kind of stretches credibility, which is when a delivery driver arrives exactly when John Doe is brought to the final crime scene at the outskirts of town, where we find out what has happened and what's in the box. It's kind of very convenient that the delivery driver arrived at the exact moment when, usually in my experience, they aren't that punctual. And I keep thinking like, okay, how funny would it be if he was like actually late and the three of them were just waiting there for like an hour or two for this delivery driver to come. But it's a minor problem and doesn't really detract from the whole movie. And one other problem I have is kind of like they keep reiterating throughout the movie that this city is just all kinds of fucked up, that it is just hopeless, that it is just completely crime-ridden, and there's nothing that can be done about it. And they do a lot of talking about that, but not really enough showing that, in my opinion. Like, they do show all of John Doe's crimes, but besides that, we don't really get that good of a sense of, like, outside of that, what is the kind of crimes that happen in this city. And, they do a good job of, like, showing you through how dilapidated everything is, but maybe, if you had added a few sort of background details here and there to show some other crimes outside of John Doe's, and then you would get, a better idea of just how fucked up the city without just constantly being told that. But that's also just another minor gripe that does not detract from the entire movie that much. And for a sophomore film, this is insanely impressive. And it gets B, and it only gets a B because even though it is a masterpiece and even though it is really great, there are some better movies and some equivalent movies coming up. And then next up we have The Game, which is kind of a downgrade but still a very enjoyable movie. And The Game is about this investment banker, I think he was, called Nicholas, played by Michael Douglas, who signs up for this thing called The Game for a company called, I'll just call them CRS because I cannot be bothered to remember what the full company's name is. And The Game is this mysterious thing that a lot of other rich dudes have participated in, and it's supposed to be this life-changing experience, but it is very mysterious and kept very aloof about what it exactly is. But as the film goes along, it starts looking a lot more conspiratorial and a lot more than just a few simple pranks and a simple life-changing experience. And this whole movie sort of hinges on this balance of CRS not doing too like mundane and boring things to Nicholas, because otherwise, why would you care about what's going on in the movie, while also not going too over the top so as to stretch credulity. And unfortunately, probably because they were trying to, keep the tension up and keep people watching, they kind of went over the top in a few scenes. And there are a few moments where I think like, okay, are they like omniscient in this movie's universe? And the first, and it's kind of a minor one, is Nicholas's briefcase gets stolen in an airport because a pen that he got from CRS was leaking in his lapel pocket. So he went to the bathroom, and I was thinking like, okay, what if he had not put that pen in there? But I guess, it's not that big of a deal. But then there's another scene that comes somewhat after that, which is when Michael Douglas is chasing after this waitress because someone from CRS told him like, okay, chase after her. And they bump into this guy who's choking in the streets, and a ambulance comes and picks him up. But I was thinking like, okay, like maybe he was fake choking, but what if he was like actually in danger? Would he have like died? And then there are also parts where CRS just does a lot of straight up illegal. Like when Nicholas goes back to his home, he finds it just completely vandalized, graffiti everywhere, and I guess the company was willing to just risk a breaking and entering case and a vandalism charge as well. And there's also a possible impersonating a police officer charge when he hollers a police cab before to help the choking man, which it's vague. It's kept vague enough that those were actually people working for CRS. And then there's also one part where there's a payphone ringing and Nicholas goes to answer it. Like, what were they going to do if he didn't answer? And then there's a part where he goes into a cab and gets locked into it. And, that's a kidnapping charge. And then there's also an attempted murder charge when the cab just drives into the ocean. And they're always thinking like, okay, what are they going to do if he dies? Are they going to be charged with murder? And they did give him like a window roller thing before. But, what if he had forgotten that? Like, would he have been trapped in this car and just slowly drowned? Or were they having, did they have people on standby to help him? I guess I just have to presume that they did. And then there's also drugging when the waitress lady, he finds out that she's, in on it. And she puts something in his drink and then he wakes up in Mexico, I think. So that's another kidnapping charge. They do kind of write off the idea that Nicholas could sue the bejesus out of CRS by saying okay, you signed a contract, they can do all of this. And admittedly, I'm not that familiar with US law, so maybe they could possibly do that. But still, a lot of the stuff that they do seems extremely risky, excessively so. So my credulity was kind of stretched out throughout the entire movie. That's not to say that I was not intrigued. I was constantly interested in seeing okay, what's coming next? How are they going to resolve this? How are they going to explain this? Is there a greater conspiracy to all of this? Because we find out when Nicholas's brother, who was the one who suggested Nicholas would take part in this, who was played by Sean Penn, he comes to him very frightened and sort of acts like there's something mysterious afoot, that CRS is doing some shady business and possibly is trying to steal from them. And then Sean Penn apparently starts thinking that Nicholas is in on it as well. But then there's also another problem of how could CRS have predicted some of this happening? Because they do give him a sort of psychological evaluation and do some brain scans, I think. And I think the implication of that whole sequence is that they're assessing what kind of personality he has so they can predict okay, this is what he's going to do there, and this is going to help him this way, and this is the best sort of game we can play on him. Throughout a lot of the movie, they really were kind of lucky that he did not either kill someone or accidentally kill himself. And this comes in at the end, where he finds the actor who played the guy who sort of introduced him to the whole CRS thing and kidnaps him and forces him to bring him to their headquarters, where he is brandishing what he believes to be a real gun, but then we find out it's a fake gun. And I was thinking okay, what if he shoots someone and then realizes that the gun is fake? Then, the whole jig would be up really early. But the biggest almost incident is when he thinks that he has killed his brother, because, there's a scene where he's on the rooftop and there's people trying to break through the door. And when they do break through the door, he shoots at them, and his brother is there in a tuxedo, and he thinks, oh God, I killed my brother. And he immediately goes to the edge of the roof and then jumps to commit And it's very lucky for them that he jumped on the exact right side where he would fall through some window that apparently did not cut him. I guess they put one of those windows that people use in movies so they can fall through them without cutting themselves. And that he did not fall on the metal bars that are holding the windows up. And that he also landed right on the inflatable mattress that broke his fall. It's very lucky that all of those things worked out for CRS. Otherwise, they may or may not have been f***ed. Otherwise, they may or may not have caused a guy to kill himself. But they do explain that the bald guy was supposed to throw him off, so I guess, that was their plan B. So I guess they were just really lucky. But overall, even though I have my issues with it, it is still a really enjoyable movie, and one which I can see myself watching again at some point. So I'll give it a D. And then we have his best movie, one of the best movies of all time, and one of my favorite movies,
Fight Club, which is one of those rare moments where the right source material gets in the hands of the right writer and the script gets into the right hands of the right director, and then you have the just perfect cast, and it all comes together to make just what is one of the few almost perfect movies. And the story of this is Edward Norton is this nameless guy who I will just call Jack for simplicity's sake, who meets this other guy called Tyler Durden. And they start up what is called Fight Club, where a bunch of dudes who are disgruntled and feel emasculated just start beating one another up for the fun of it. And that eventually escalates to a point where Tyler Durden has created this whole terrorist cult, at which point Edward Norton's character Jack has to go and stop them. And let's start off with the cast, which is just pitch perfect. There is Edward Norton as Jack, who really works as this sort of regular Joe who is depressed as fuck. And his voice is just so perfect for the voiceovers, this sort of monotone perfection. And then there is, of course, Brad Pitt, who it's great that they found the sort of leading Hollywood sex symbol of the time to play a guy who's supposed to be the male idea, while also finding someone who is really good at playing these crazy off-the-wall characters. Like, all of my favorite Brad Pitt performances, like in 12 Monkeys or Burn After Reading, are the characters where he's able to really go almost over the top and really crazy. It also helps that Pitt is more than charismatic enough to play Tyler, and his charisma sort of makes his pseudo-philosophical rants throughout the movie way more convincing. And then there is, of course, Helena Bonham Carter as Marla Singer, who not only just looks the part, but also gives a lot of really subtle acting throughout the movie. My favorite part being when she is interacting with Jack, and to her, we find out this out later, she is interacting with Tyler. So she has to show this sort of confusion when Jack has just completely shifted personalities, and also show this sort of frustration of dating someone who is schizophrenic without knowing that. And then there's another star in this movie, which is the voiceovers, which this is one of my favorite uses of voiceover narration in movies, because it's not really used to exposit a lot, which, you know, it kind of is throughout the movie, but it's also used to sort of give you a greater understanding of who the character is, who Jack is, and his sort of outlook and how he feels about people. And one of my favorite examples of this is one of the few leitmotifs that is used throughout the movie, which is the I am Jack's insert body part here, which is used throughout the movie to give you an idea of how Jack feels. Like in the scene where they are running out of the fancy restaurant after threatening to cut a government official's balls off, and he sees Brad Pitt sort of congratulate Jared Leto's character, and he feels really jealous. And he says something like, I am Jack's total sense of rejection, or something like that. And that sort of gives you an idea, okay, this is sort of how he feels. This is how he feels jealous of other men getting attention from Tyler. Also, a brief diversion. This is one of my favorite Jared Leto performances, which is kind of surprising because he's not an actor I'm the biggest fan of. And if I continue doing this series, you will probably see me complain about him a lot more because he for some reason shows up in a lot of movies that I like. But here, you know, because he doesn't really do a lot, and he is especially bearable because you see him getting his face beaten in. Which brings me to how this movie depicts violence. It is totally unglorified and just absolutely brutal and disgusting. One of my favorite scenes is when Tyler is beating up the bar owner and just pukes blood on him. It's so gross and so morbid, and shows just how dangerous Tyler is when he goes really insane. When he sort of drops the charismatic Ubermensch philosopher king persona and really shows just how off the wall crazy he really is. And what really helps sell the violence, besides the fantastic makeup effects and blood effects and all that, is the sound design. Because in a lot of other movies, punching sounds are really fake. It doesn't really sound like somebody's being punched. But here, Fincher really made sure that they would create something that would not only sound like someone getting punched, but would also evoke this sort of visceral feeling that you're supposed to get in some of the fight scenes. And I think what they did was they filled a whole chicken with like walnuts or something like that and actually punched it. So, you know, you get the feeling of flesh
hitting flesh, but also the sort of crunch of like bone and teeth cracking or something like that. The set design is also fantastic in this movie. My favorite part being the dilapidated house on Paper Street, which is just, it is one of the best looking shithole houses in just film history. It just looks like the kind of place where you feel like you would need to take a shower just perpetually by only living there. And then there are also the special effects that hold up really well for a movie that came out, in 1999? Like, some of them look kind of rough, but not distractingly so. And the buildings collapsing is a good example of just how realistic a lot of the effects are. I can see a movie today being released with that kind of effect. And with that all of the way, I would like to talk a little bit about like what this movie is about and how it has been kind of misunderstood and misaligned since its release. And to me, this movie is about how when men feel emasculated and purposeless, they are more susceptible to the influence of charismatic strongmen like Tyler Durden and to being radicalized to the sort of anarcho-primitivist cult that he has created. It's also kind of ironic how many men have misunderstood this movie and idolized Tyler and just regurgitated every fucking quote from him, despite the fact that in the movie, the guys who do that, his followers, his space monkeys, as they're called, are just depicted as morons, as these sort of brainwashed sheep. I'm just thinking like, okay, did we watch the same movie? Do you really want to be like those guys? So overall, just a fantastic masterpiece that I could spend like hours talking about and breaking down, and will probably be another video that I make on this channel, and I will be giving this the A tier. And it should tell you just how great this movie is that I would put 7 beneath it. Now for a little bit of a change of pace with Panic Room, which in contrast to Fight Club, which is this complex, thematically rich and subversive masterpiece, we have here just a pretty simple thriller, but you know, it's a simple thriller made by David Fincher, so it's bound to be good. And the story of this movie is that a recently divorced mother, played by Jodie Foster, moves into a new apartment in New York with her daughter, played by a then very young Kristen Stewart. The movie starts off pretty slow, but like 15 minutes in, it really starts up when a group of burglars come in, played by Forrest Whitaker, another played by Jared Leto, who I will talk about later, and another played by Dwight Yoakam. And when they break in, Jodie Foster wakes up, realizes, and runs with her daughter to the Panic Room, which is in this house. Which is kind of unfortunate because the burglars are there specifically for something in the Panic Room. So what starts is this sort of cat and mouse game where the burglars have to constantly find ways to get inside of the Panic Room to get what they're after, and Jodie Foster trying to survive while also trying to get outside hell. And a lot of this film's concept relies on how do you keep things interesting with the main characters trapped in one place. And the way they do that is with the mental battles between the mother and daughter and the burglars, where one side comes up with a way to get inside of the Panic Room, and the other finds a way to thwart them, and then they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, continually escalating from there. And that is definitely the best part of this movie, because each side's solution is very inventive and logical. And you're constantly on the edge of your toes thinking like, okay, what are they going to do next? How are they going to get out of this situation? How are they going to get help? And it really keeps you interested throughout. As for the acting, Jodie Foster is, great as always, though her character is like not the most interesting, but she works for the movie. Kristen Stewart, despite being very young, is, not that bad, but nothing to write home about. But then again, she was like, 12 when she was in this? So then there's Jared Leto, who I really do not like in this movie because he does this thing that he does in so many of his other roles where he just whisper talks, and I found him to be very overacting a lot of the time. But thankfully he gets shot early on in the movie, so, you don't need to deal with him all the time. Then you're left with Forrest Whitaker, who is playing the film's best character because he's not a bad guy. He's just like a blue-collar worker who is down on his luck, who got lured by the money, who is the only robber there who is like has any moral compass. And then you have Raoul, who is just a complete creep and murderous psychopath who is the most dangerous out of all of them. And I think it's a testament to Whitaker's performance that at the end of the movie when he gets caught, I actually really felt bad for him. And I really felt like, okay, yeah, you try to rob someone and you did put these people's lives in danger, but you should be able to escape. And overall, this movie is just, a pure, simple thriller, but it's also just pretty good. I will put this at D. And then next up, we have Zodiac, which is a historical drama about the Zodiac killing. And overall, this movie is pretty great, with one sort of glaring issue, which is I don't think it really justifies its length. Like early on, I felt it drag a little bit. I felt like it could have been cut down a bit. But once they move on to the first main suspect, that's when the movie really picks up. Especially when we get to the scene where Mark Ruffalo's character is interviewing the suspect and he just looks like the most suspicious guy in the world. Checks all the boxes while also not feeling too over the top. But the movie overall kind of feels a little bit too exhaustive, a bit too long, and at a certain point it's kind of feeling like an eternity. But it does evoke a lot of interest in the case, especially because a lot of the scenes where we see him kill, the way it's handled is very matter-of-factly. There's not like a lot of music, there's not like a lot of dramatization. It's just very, okay, here's how this probably happened, and here's the most realistic way I can depict that, and that makes the killings all the more brutal. And even though I had problems with the film's length, in the final third, it's probably the best part, where we see Jake Gyllenhaal's character, who is this character who is conducting his own independent investigation of this case, and who will eventually write a book about it. And we see him sort of collating all of the leads to eventually come to the conclusion that the main suspect was this Lee character, who I'm blanking on the actor's name, but he does an excellent job. I know he's Margot's husband in Fargo. Felt really uneasy every time he was on screen. And Gyllenhaal as well gives a really subtle performance. Like, he always shines as these sort of awkward guys, even though he's like extremely handsome. And he also really sells the character's obsession as well. And then there's Robert Downey Jr., I think pre-Iron Man, who, does give a pretty typical Downey Jr. performance. But he works for the movie. Even though I was kind of bored by some of this film, I would say it's still really solid, so I'll put it at D tier. And then we have a really interesting movie for David Fincher, which is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. And it feels really weird when put alongside the rest of his filmography, because what you have is like a whole bunch of pretty realistic movies, a lot of them involving like crime and murder and stuff. And then you have this whimsical, magical realism movie that feels more like it would have been directed by one of the original directors assigned to this project, Steven Spielberg, who I think this movie began development in like 1990 something. And Spielberg was supposed to direct it, then he moved on to something else. And then there was one other version that was supposed to be written by Charlie Kaufman and directed by Spike Jonze, which is a version of this movie I really want to see. But instead we have this movie, which is kind of a dud. Like, we have the same problem as Zodiac, where it's just a bit too long. I did not feel it was justified to have that many characters in it and have that many scenes in it, because a lot of them don't feel like they go anywhere, and few of them really evoke that much interest in me. And I think it's telling that at the half-hour mark, when I thought that the movie was like maybe an hour in or an hour and 20 minutes in, it was only like half an hour in, then I started feeling like, oh god, there's so much more of this movie left. And then when the movie was actually halfway done, I just felt like this movie felt like an eternity. So the story of this movie is a child is born, but it's born as an old man and then ages backwards. And it's adopted by this black couple who work in a retirement home. And that leads me to one major problem with this movie, which is that the effects have not aged well. Like, maybe back in 2008, the Brad Pitt de-aging effects would have looked pretty solid, but now they look creepy as hell. Especially later on in the movie, where Brad Pitt stops using this sort of raspy voice and starts talking more like his normal voice. And you see his normal voice come out of this like CGI old man demon, which really kind of ruins a lot of the whimsical tone this movie is trying to evoke. And overall, this movie was just kind of disappointing for me. I was not really interested in his character. I was not really interested in any of the side characters, even though this movie has like one hell of a cast. Like you have Brad Pitt, who, when you put Brad Pitt in a David Fincher movie, I expect great things, but not here. And then you also have Kate Blanchett as his love interest, who, does a pretty good job. And then you also have Tilda Swinton and like a whole bunch of other characters. I just realized that Mahershala Ali is in this movie. But I just could not get into the movie's tone. I could not get into the story, which is this very episodic narrative where Benjamin Button just moves on to one point in his life. And once the main gimmick of Brad Pitt aging backwards sort of wears off, which it happens like very early on in the movie, I just could not be bothered to care about much of anything that happened here. Although this movie does have a lot of highlights, I really enjoyed Jared Harris's character as this drunken sailor. And, some of his scenes were fine, but then, he dies early on, and then what you're left with is not that interesting. And also, I really liked the ending. That is probably the crowning achievement of this movie. When we see Benjamin Button, who is now mentally an old man and has dementia and is just forgetting everything, but he's also a kid, and just the horror of that, the horror of having your mind just slowly wither away as you grow younger. I just wish that everything that came before was a little bit tighter and a little bit more interesting, because there is a really great movie in this. They just did not find it. So this is probably one of his worst, and I would put that at E. But he was quick to follow up with another great movie, which is The Social Network, which tells the story of Mark Zuckerberg and the creation of Facebook. And starting off, we have the first scene, which is very simple, but also very brilliant, because it gives you pretty much everything you need to know. It gives you a great introduction to Mark's character, who is this sort of prickly, smarter-than-thou prodigy, who is played just to perfection by Jesse Eisenberg, while also giving you the inciting incident, which is him getting rejected by his girlfriend for being a complete asshole. So this movie is a lot of firsts. It is the first and only collaboration between David Fincher and Aaron Sorkin. And it's also, I think, I was too lazy to actually fact check this, but I think this is the first collaboration between David Fincher and composers Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. Although a lot of this movie's soundtrack is just tracks from the Nine Inch Nails Ghosts album, which is kind of distracting because I hear those tunes a lot from YouTube videos, because for whatever reason you're able to use those. But it also has a lot of other just fantastic tracks, and this is definitely one of my favorite director and composer pairings. And here we have Fincher again tackling something new and something outside of his comfort zone, which is just a drama about the creation of a social media empire. And here, the screenwriter, Aaron Sorkin, made the very wise choice of centering this around the friendship of Mark Zuckerberg and his soon-to-be ex-partner, Eduardo, and just seeing their friendship fall apart throughout this entire movie, which is just the main heart and the main driving force of the story. And what really helps this is the performances of Eisenberg and Garfield. Eisenberg is based on what we've seen of how Zuckerberg acts in real life, he's a bit maybe too human. They were probably trying to create another version of Mark Zuckerberg that wasn't really accurate, but worked better for the kind of story they were trying to make, which is this sort of prickly asshole with a chip on his shoulder. And then Garfield also works well because he's a very affable actor. It's very easy to sympathize with him when we see everything that he helped build being sort of taken away from him as the two of them drift further apart. And then you have also other great performances like Justin Timberlake as Sean Parker, the founder of Napster, who plays this sort of rock star programmer. And then another star in this movie is the dialogue written by Aaron Sorkin, which is very wordy, but it never feels bloated. I never felt like there was a wasted word in this entire script. And a lot of the scenes are really carried by the dialogue. And a lot of the scenes are made by the snappy comebacks that each character comes with. And overall, this movie is just great presentation, great casting, great music, great script. Everything comes together just really well. And this is probably one of the best villain origin stories of all time. And I would put this at C.
And then we have David Fincher kind of returning to his roots by adapting the Stieg Larsson thriller The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, which is kind of an unfortunate movie because of what would happen later on with the studio not really wanting to foot the bill for the rest of the trilogy, because Fincher was hoping to adapt the 3 books that Stieg Larsson had put out. But what we have now is just a very solid crime thriller with great acting and great cast, starting with Daniel Craig as Mikael Blomkvist, who I would say works really great in this role, even though he does not look like Mikael Blomkvist is described in the books, which, having read all of them, one of my main gripes is with how it is kind of a self-insert of Stieg Larsson, because Stieg Larsson was kind of a chubby reporter. Mikael Blomkvist in the books is a chubby reporter, and throughout the entire book series, Mikael Blomkvist just fucks. Like, he fucks almost every single female that he comes in contact with who is remotely attractive. Like, he is having sex with one of his co-workers or his boss who is like in an open marriage or something like that, and he's fucking like some of the members of the family who he is investigating, and he also fucks Lisbeth Salander, and then later on in the 3rd book he hooks up with his like secret agent muscle mommy. So like the amount of times this guy has sex is kind of strange credulity. But you know, Daniel Craig, because he kind of has this sort of ugly handsome vibe, he works way better. And then you also have Stellan Skarsgård, who does a great job of appearing as this likable guy who's above suspicion before you realize, oh god, he's the murderer. And then during his reveal, he's made even more creepy by just how polite he is. And then you have the film's main star, the main asset of what could have been a great franchise maybe, Lisbeth Salander, played by Rooney Mara, who just really immersed herself in this role. Like, one of my favorite kinds of performances is when you cannot see the actor. When you think like, okay, I'm not watching someone who has the beauty and physique of a supermodel play some normal person or play some other person. I'm just watching a real human being on screen. And Rooney Mara really brings that here. Like, beyond just the appearance and the costumes and the piercings and everything, she really is convincing as this just totally broken and outcast person who feels betrayed by everyone else and who is really looking for some sort of meaningful connection with someone else. Now, the story of this movie is that Mikael Blomkvist, now disgraced reporter, is hired by the head of this rich family to investigate them and to find who had murdered his cousin some decades back. And then halfway through the movie, he enlists the help of Lisbeth Salander, who is this genius hacker who had sort of investigated him before for the rich guy who had hired Mikael Blomkvist. And they go looking for this murderer who they found out is a serial killer of specifically women. This movie has a very interesting structure because you have the main plot, which is Mikael Blomkvist trying to break this case, and then you have Lisbeth Salander's story, which does not really connect much with the rest of the film besides the fact that she is in it, but it does show her really just f***ed up and broken life, especially when she is put in the care of this perverted social worker who does something to her which I am not allowed to say on YouTube in a couple of scenes that are just really brutal and just gut-wrenching. The scenes really being made by Rooney Mara's acting in it, the music, which is just this very dread-inducing drone, creates something that is just horrifying to watch, which is then followed by her revenge, which is very brutal, but also really cathartic as hell. And it's one of those scenes where I was just wondering, like, how is this not just X-rated to oblivion? And even though this movie is close to the length of Zodiac and Benjamin Button, it never really bothered me because of how tight the script is. And even when the case is closed and everything's wrapped up, I really didn't mind that we follow Lisbeth Salander for like another, like, what was it, 15 minutes? To see her try to help Mikael Blomkvist with his issues. What this movie is, it's less about the actual case. It's more of a sort of starting point of what would have been a 3-part film series, mostly following her. So it's very much warranted that the movie ends with her trying to help Mikael Blomkvist with his issues and to help him clear his name. So overall, just a really solid crime thriller. And even though I've been effusive with praise with it, it's not like
that much special, so I'll put it at D tier. And then we move on to another fantastic movie, Gone Girl. So the story of this movie is that this guy played by Ben Affleck, his wife goes missing, and as the case is investigated, it becomes clearer and clearer that maybe he might have been the guy who murdered her. And they really do a great job of convincing you of Nick's guilt. Like throughout the movie, we see excerpts from Amy, his wife's diary, where we learn about some of his abusive behavior, some of their money problems, and throughout all of it, we sort of see a motive build up. And then we also find out that he has a mistress and that he has been making a lot of purchases, possibly ones that he was hoping to pay with her life insurance. And this is also really sold by some of the scenes where after Nick pushes her, it is sort of like almost a horror movie, and we see Nick looking really sort of sinister, like he's thinking about murdering her. And also Ben Affleck really does a great job of writing this thin line between looking guilty, especially when he's like angry, and looking befuddled. In earlier parts of the movie, he does sort of look like he could possibly have been the one who murdered her. But then also when you find out what actually happened, his acting also works as someone who is really confused about all of this. But then we found out that, oh no, Amy is alive and she's been setting her husband up in the hopes that he will be executed. And we also find out that she is a just monstrous, manipulative psychopath who has concocted this just insanely detailed plan to just bury her husband. And she is played by this movie's real star Rosamund Pike, who just steals the show, who gives a just almost a flawless portrayal of a psychopathic manipulator who is just equal parts terrifying and despicable, but just also incredibly fun to watch. And one aspect that I found really interesting about this movie is the exploration of media manipulation, and how it shows like how mass media channels exploit tragedy while pretending to care, and how psychopaths can use that to their favor to destroy people's lives. And to me, the ending is just perfect, like equal parts horrifying and almost hilarious in a very morbid way. And you end up being just absolutely terrified of Amy and really terrified for Nick, knowing how just absolutely trapped he is. So overall, just a fantastic movie. B tier. And then we have Mank, a movie that a lot of people are like lukewarm about or don't really like, but it's a movie that I absolutely love. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I am a film history buff, as you can see by most of the videos that I make here. And I really have a lot of interest in this era of filmmaking and in the movie that this film is covering. And I've just really loved the whole presentation of this movie. And the story here is, this is the story of Herman Mankiewicz, the screenwriter for what is often considered one of, if not the greatest film of all time, Citizen Kane. And it sort of tells two stories. One is about him writing it and collaborating with Orson Welles. And the other is about what life events led to him being inspired to write it and what led to him eventually wanting to get credit for the film. Because initially, Orson Welles wanted to take all the credit and just hired Mankiewicz as a ghostwriter. But then Mankiewicz decided, okay, I want to be remembered for this script. And I just really love the presentation of this film. Instead of just making a straightforward biopic, they instead decided to make it like it would have been made back when the film happens. They not only shot it in black and white, like even though it was shot in digital, they made sure to make it look like it was shot in film. And they also distorted the audio to make it sound like movies back in the day. They even added like a lot of really great details, like cigarette burns. If you watched Fight Club, you would know what those are, but cigarette burns are a sort of signal that were supposed to let a projectionist know when they were supposed to switch reels. So when a circle that looks like a cigarette burn appears, that's when you know, okay, time to switch reels, and so the movie carries on. They also had all the actors sort of act the way people would have been in movies back in the day as well, which brings me to the cast, which is kind of redundant at this point because it's a David Fincher film, but like every other David Fincher movie, cast is fucking immaculate. You have Gary Oldman as Mankiewicz, who really disappears into the role, and his drunk acting is just so realistic. His slacked posture really helps evoke the idea of him being this past his prime alcoholic mess, while also showing his sort of wit and intelligence. I also love how a lot of the cinematography of this film kind of looks like it was very much inspired by Citizen Kane and Greg Toland's work. Like in the scene where Mankiewicz is recovering after a car accident, and we see the silhouette of Orson Welles coming to greet him and to offer him the job of writing Citizen Kane, that looks exactly like the kind of shot that you would see Greg Toland make, or the kind of shot that Orson Welles would want in his movies. Now, this movie does have a few issues. Like, you can still kind of see that this was definitely shot on digital, because it's a lot crisper than any movie that would have been shot in the 1940s. But a lot of the fake artifacting and a lot of the detail that was put into selling this illusion of a movie made in the 40s pretty much helps you forget all that throughout the movie. And also, I found the subplot of the woman who is sort of nursing Mankiewicz, played by, what was her name? Lily Collins, I think. Yeah, I found the subplot surrounding her to be not that interesting and kind of dragged down some of the scenes she was in. And I can kind of understand why a lot of people don't really like this movie a lot, because it feels like a movie made for film buffs by a film buff. But since I am a film buff, and because I am very much interested in film history, this movie feels kind of tailor-made for me. So I will have to give it a C rating. And then finally we have The Killer, which is a movie that has proven to be very polarizing. Some people really not liking it, some people loving it. So coming in, I was very interested to see like what the hubbub was about. And what this film is about is a contract killer, played by Michael Fassbender, who after failing an assassination is chased by his organization and has to hunt down all the people coming after him if he ever wants to live a quiet life again. And about 15 minutes of the movie, I could kind of see why a lot of people are finding issues with it. Because it starts off with this scene where the killer is getting ready for his assassination. And it's this very long, contracted sequence of him staking out the scene, getting ready. And throughout it all, there's this incessant narration where we first hear his mantra of stick to the plan, something like that, don't improvise, and have no mercy and stuff like that. I'm paraphrasing, of course. That leads me to the main issue, which is it's very repetitive. Each scene is basically him coming in, repeating his mantra of stick to the plan, don't improvise, and then having his plan fail and having to improvise, and then going away and then going on to his next target while saying have no empathy or something like that. And it's that again and again and again and again and again. And my main problem is it really started to drain on me like halfway through the movie, which is not helped by the fact that I was not really invested in Michael Fassbender's character. Like in this movie, he's playing this sort of, on the surface, he appears to be this like very cold, reptilian, meticulous master assassin. Whereas you find out later on, as his narration goes on and you see more of him, that he's kind of an edgelord and kind of try hard. Like there's this one moment where he genuinely uses the word normies to describe other people. And that brings me to like what this movie is supposed to be about, or what its themes are. And I've heard a lot of talk about like, okay, this is sort of satirizing the sort of Sigma male mentality. And I also heard that it's supposed to be like a self-effacing commentary of Fincher, where he's, you know, making fun of himself for being this super meticulous, super micromanaging and excessively controlling man. But to me, it doesn't really matter what the film is trying to say, because regardless of that, if the main story of the film and everything else is not really interesting to me, I do not feel motivated to actually try to analyze a film that deeply. Overall, this just did not work for me. Like, it has some fun scenes, like when he's sniping, that was really tense, and you keep thinking like, okay, how is he gonna fuck this up? Is he gonna succeed? And some of the scenes of him trying to escape and trying to cover his track were really fun as well. And of course, I really liked the Tilda Swinton scene, but overall, although this movie has some fun scenes and character, it is kind of a dud with a boring main character, repetitive story, and annoying voiceovers. I was really disappointed by the score as well, because it feels like either someone trying and failing to imitate Trent Reznor and Alex Ross, or it feels like a stock version of their music. That is not to say that this is a bad movie, and it is fascinating and I might maybe see it again, but my initial experience was not that great, so I'll put it at the front of E, because it's not as bad as these movies, but it's not at this level either. So that was the David Fincher tier list. If you want to tell me what you feel about it, then make sure to comment. And if you like this, then make sure to like and subscribe and ring the bell for more videos like this. And if you want me to cover any other director, then write their name in the comments below. With that said, this has been my tier list for David Fincher, and since I have no idea how to actually end this, I'll just say goodbye.